I had potential, but potential means nothing without action. That is one of the hardest truths I have ever had to face, because for a long time, potential felt like comfort. It felt like identity. It felt like hope. People told me I was smart, capable, talented, full of promise. They said I could do a lot with my life. They said I had what it takes. And I believed them. Maybe too much. Because when a person grows up hearing that they have potential, they can begin to confuse possibility with progress. They can start thinking that being capable is somehow a kind of achievement. It is not. It is only raw material. And raw material, no matter how valuable, is useless if it never becomes anything real. For years, I lived on that difference without fully understanding it. I was always the person who could have, the one who could do well if he really applied himself, the one who understood things quickly, the one people expected something from, the one who seemed like he was on the edge of doing something meaningful. I lived inside that identity so long that I did not notice how dangerous it was becoming. Because praise for potential can become a drug. It can make you feel special without requiring anything concrete. It can make you feel as though your future already contains value simply because it could. And if you are not careful, you begin feeding on imagined outcomes instead of building real ones. That was me. I was not lazy in the obvious sense. I was thoughtful, curious, often reflective. I had ideas, plans, interests, intensity in bursts. I could see big pictures. I could feel what was possible. I could talk well about what needed to change. I could describe the version of life I wanted. But wanting is not doing. Understanding is not building. Being gifted is not being disciplined. And life does not hand out results for inner potential. It responds to action, repetition, risk, effort, structure, and follow-through. Those were the things I respected in theory much sooner than I practiced them in reality. I think one of the cruelest things about potential is that it makes delay feel less dangerous than it really is. If you know you have ability, you can always tell yourself you will use it later. You can always say, I still could. I still might. I'm just not in the right season. I'm just not focused right now. I'll get serious soon. The belief in your own ability becomes a cushion. It protects you from urgency. It lets you postpone in the name of eventual greatness. And that is exactly how gifted people waste years. Not because they have no vision, because vision without urgency becomes fantasy. I wasted years like that, more than I care to admit. Years thinking deeply but moving too slowly. Years imagining better versions of my life without fully submitting to the work required to make them real. Years starting and stopping. Years planning without committing. Years letting self-awareness make me feel closer to transformation than I actually was. That is one of the strangest traps intelligent people fall into. They understand so much that they mistake understanding for movement. They can explain their patterns, describe their fears, identify their strengths, and articulate their goals, and yet none of that changes the material reality of their lives if action remains inconsistent. That is what I had to confront. I was not suffering from a lack of possibility. I was suffering from a lack of applied possibility, a lack of embodied effort, a lack of disciplined execution, a lack of the humble, repetitive, often boring behavior that turns promise into proof. And the longer I avoided that truth, the more painful it became. Because every year you sit on potential, it gets heavier. It stops feeling like freedom and starts feeling like accusation. It starts asking you a question you do not want to answer. If you are so capable, why is your life still shaped by hesitation? That question haunted me for years. I would look at people who had built things, changed things, committed to things, and part of me would feel admiration, but another part would feel discomfort, because I knew I was not entirely watching people with more talent. Often I was watching people with more action, more consistency, more courage to look ordinary at the beginning, more willingness to be bad before they got good, more willingness to risk being seen trying. That last part matters more than people think. Many people with potential stay frozen not because they lack ability, but because they cannot tolerate the humbling process of becoming. They want their early action to match their inner image. When it does not, they retreat. I did that more than once. I wanted results that matched what I believed about myself, but I did not always want to endure the unglamorous gap between talent and mastery. I did not always want to produce messy early work. I did not always want to expose inconsistency. I did not always want to do the slow building that would reveal how undeveloped my potential actually still was. So instead of building, I would think, reflect, prepare, reconsider, delay. That can look mature from the outside, but often it is just fear protecting pride. Potential also creates a strange kind of emotional debt. People expect things from you. Sometimes you do too. You carry the feeling that you are meant for more, that you should be further, that your life should already look different by now. And if action does not catch up with that inner expectation, the gap becomes painful. You begin living with a private sense of underperformance, not always visible to others, but very visible to you. You feel it when you look at your age, when you look at your unfinished projects, your neglected gifts, the dreams you still describe in future tense. Your life begins feeling crowded with unrealized versions of yourself. That was my reality. I had books I had not written, work I had not built, habits I had not formed, depth I had not fully lived out. There were parts of me that stayed theoretical for too long, and theory can be a very seductive place for a person with potential. In theory, everything still lives. In theory, your gifts are untouched by failure. In theory, the dream remains pure. In theory, you can still imagine an impressive future. But reality is where a life gets formed. Reality is where potential either becomes service, craft, contribution, stability, and substance, or it becomes regret. I wish I had learned sooner that potential is perishable. Not in the sense that intelligence disappears overnight, but in the sense that unused gifts change shape over time. Energy changes, courage changes, available years change, seasons change. A person who could have started something meaningful at 30 does not begin with the same internal conditions at 55. That does not mean it is impossible later. It means delay has a cost, a real one. And potential fools people into underestimating that cost because it always whispers, you still could. But could is not a life. Could is a ghost that follows people into old age. The most painful thing is that the world often reinforces the trap. People tell gifted people they are special before they have built anything. They praise intelligence early. They celebrate talent early. They are impressed by signs of promise. But life itself is not impressed by promise. It is shaped by behavior, by whether you show up when the work is boring, by whether you continue when your ego is bruised, by whether you commit when applause is absent, by whether you build when inspiration is low. That is where many lives quietly divide. One person keeps protecting their identity as someone with potential. Another person accepts being ordinary long enough to become real. I stayed attached to the first identity too long. I wanted to be thought of as capable. I wanted to feel that my future was still rich with possibility. But I did not always respect what possibility demands. Action demands exposure. Action demands incompletion. Action demands that you stop explaining yourself and start producing evidence. Action is humbling because it reveals the distance between who you imagine yourself to be and what your habits have actually prepared you to do. Many people prefer the fantasy because the fantasy protects self-image. Reality threatens it. But reality is the only place where change lives. There were stretches of my life where I would become intensely motivated for short periods. I would read, plan, organize, set goals, imagine a new chapter, and feel alive in the anticipation of becoming more. But then, ordinary life would return. Fatigue, discomfort, uncertainty, slow progress, repetition, and I would lose momentum. That cycle is more dangerous than people think, because it gives you just enough emotional movement to feel like you are changing while your life remains essentially the same. You become addicted to the feeling of transformation rather than transformation itself. I know now that real growth is much less dramatic. It is often quiet, repetitive, invisible for a while. It does not always feel inspiring. Sometimes it feels embarrassingly small. One page, 1 hour, one workout, one difficult conversation, one honest choice repeated enough times that it becomes identity. Potential hates small beginnings because potential wants to skip to significance. But significance is built through small faithfulness. I did not respect that deeply enough when I was younger. I also think potential can become an excuse for not learning discipline. If you are naturally good at some things, it is easy to trust talent more than structure. You tell yourself you can always pull it together when needed. You tell yourself you work better under pressure. You tell yourself your mind is just different. Maybe sometimes that is true in a limited sense. But eventually, life reveals something talent does not want to hear. People with structure often surpass people with ability. Not because they are more gifted, because they are more buildable. Their lives can hold the weight of consistent effort, and consistency compounds in ways bursts of brilliance rarely do. That realization was humbling for me. I had to admit that some people I once quietly underestimated were further than me in the areas that mattered, not because they had more potential, but because they respected action more. They built. They repeated. They endured the boring middle. They did not need to feel exceptional to keep going. They simply kept going. That is one of the most mature things I have ever learned. Life rewards reliability more than it rewards hidden capacity. There is a special kind of sadness in becoming older while still carrying too much unrealized self inside you. You begin to feel crowded by your own could-have-beens. You remember versions of yourself that almost started, almost committed, almost followed through. And eventually, you have to ask a hard question. What has all this potential actually become? Not what could it become someday. What has it become now? That question can be brutal, but it is necessary, because it forces you out of the comforting fantasy of future possibility and into the more honest world of present reality. For me, that question became a turning point. Not because I answered it heroically, because I could no longer avoid it. I looked at my age, my habits, my unfinished things, my repeated cycles, and I knew I had to stop admiring potential and start respecting action. I had to stop romanticizing my gifts and start proving them. I had to accept that no one is coming to convert possibility into life for me. Not encouragement, not praise, not intelligence, not insight. Only action can do that. And action, I eventually learned, is not a mood. It is a standard. It is not something you wait to feel. It is something you build around. It is something you protect with routines, decisions, boundaries, humility, and repetition. Once I understood that, something softened in me. I stopped needing my path to feel dramatic. I stopped trying to preserve an image of myself as uniquely capable. I became more willing to be a beginner where I should have been a beginner years earlier, more willing to move imperfectly, more willing to let work, not self-concept, decide who I was becoming. I wish I had done that sooner. I wish I had spent fewer years taking comfort in my own unrealized ability. I wish I had understood that potential without action does not stay neutral. It decays into regret. It becomes a private wound. It becomes the sentence you hear in quiet moments. You could have done more. Not because you lacked talent, because you kept treating talent like a substitute for obedience to the work. If I could speak to my younger self, I would tell him this. Stop being proud of what you could do and become accountable for what you actually do. Stop protecting your image as a gifted person and start earning the right to trust your own future. Stop confusing insight with movement. Stop waiting to feel more certain than the process requires. Stop imagining that your gifts owe you results. They do not. They only offer you possibility. The rest is labor, discipline, repetition, courage, and time. I would tell him that humility is the bridge between potential and action, because humility lets you start small. Humility lets you fail publicly. Humility lets you be unimpressive for a while. Humility lets you do the work without constantly checking whether it matches your self-image. Potential without humility becomes fragile. It would rather dream than risk. It would rather stay admired in theory than exposed in reality. That fragility steals lives. And that is what I want to say to anyone listening now who has been told they have potential, or who secretly still believes they do. Good. Maybe you do. Maybe you have more in you than your current life reflects. Maybe you are bright, capable, perceptive, gifted. But none of that matters if it remains trapped in imagination, fear, perfectionism, inconsistency, or pride. Potential only matters when it enters time, when it takes form, when it accepts the discipline of action. I had potential, but potential means nothing without action. That sentence hurts me because it tells the truth about years I can never recover. But maybe it can save someone else years of the same mistake. If that someone is you, then hear me clearly. Do not build your identity around what you might do someday. Build it around what you are willing to do now, quietly, imperfectly, repeatedly, even when no one is impressed. Because in the end, unrealized potential is not noble. It is only unrealized. And life is too short to keep mistaking possibility for progress.